Welcome to a new technical article I am so happy to share with all of you. You can find this article and more on my blog site at www.ideliversoft.com. And now, please listen to my colleague Martin Ellingham, who will present the topic for today: Azure APIs for SharePoint access with Microsoft Graph.
I have done some work for one of my clients and created the design, the implementation, and the development environment for a few Azure functions. These functions uploads and downloads files to a SharePoint site and other mediums, Azure Blob Storage, etc. My client is already paying for a Microsoft Office 365 subscription, having more than 1,000 users, and the space available in SharePoint could be used at no extra cost when comparing with storing the files in other mediums, Azure Cloud, integrated vendor solution, etc. The SharePoint license my client is already paying for allows for a storage space size of 267 terabytes, that is, 100 terabytes plus 100 gigabytes per A5 user. You can read more details about the prices calculation at this link. The point of this article is to describe the solution, the configuration and deployment scripts, and show you how a simple build will create all the required objects in the Azure cloud with the appropriate permissions. Once the build has completed, you can make a call to upload or download a file from the SharePoint site, and everything will work with no other manual intervention. In presenting these details, I will show you a couple of limitations and workarounds you need to be aware of and one cool implementations detail that I think you will appreciate. This diagram has been created with Lucidchart. A few details for the above diagram. The Function app, when I'm creating and deploying in Azure, performs authentication to an app registration via a certificate. The app registration has been configured with the required permissions to access SharePoint. The Function app is reading the certificate from the Azure Key Vault. The API management is using the Function app as a setup source and is configured via access policies that requires the use of a certificate as well. The API management is called from external users, while the Function app it is protected via external access using a service endpoint access restrictions to be discussed in Part 2 of this article. There are several alternatives to consider when choosing a solution for integrating with SharePoint. When you have the need to move the files from a particular storage you are currently using to SharePoint, you can use PowerShell scripts. They are easy to use and can support your automation process. If you are familiar with tools that relies on creating visual workflows, you can use Azure Logic Apps and Azure Data Factory. Both are using SharePoint connectors. Programmatically, you have two options, using the Pattern and Practices SDK or the Microsoft Graph API. The reason why I have selected Graph API versus PnP SDK is because the latter is open source technology and does not provide the necessary support my client needs. Let's review a few implementations details about the Function app. The code is adding a graphic client via dependency injection and makes it available to the Upload Document service. The graphic service clients authenticate in Azure via a certificate. The example here is using the client secret for simplicity and running the code locally. As a note, the load certificate function can be used for local executions and load the certificate from the computer's certificate store. The graphic service client it is used to call the Graph API's functions, as you can see here. The certificate used to authenticate, it is retrieved from the function configuration properties via the syntax binding presented here. The properties for this function app have been changed to accommodate the deployment, and we will discuss this at a later time. The certificate is stored in the key vault and accessed via the managed identity of the Functions app. As a note, I have cleaned up some of the Azure resources from my last execution, so some object IDs we are looking at are not the ones we are expecting. In the next segment, I will show you how you can use Postman to learn more about the Graph APIs. When making the calls to the deployed function in the API management, you will need to pass the certificate into the request. This is done by loading the certificate in Postman. It makes sense to have all types of certificate files extracted from your certificate. I am using the APIM function to download a file from my SharePoint site, and you can see the certificate being displayed in the Postman console. My SharePoint site contains a few files, and I would like to retrieve a particular file's version and metadata. I have created a column named Custom Attribute, and I am updating and retrieving the values stored in this column. As a potential wonderful awful idea, you can store the percentage the last version of this file has changed versus the previous file's version. To understand better the Graph APIs, you need to read the API's documentation and to use Postman to see the results. Here is an example. Get the particular drive ID where my documents are located. Make a note for this ID. Get the item ID for the file I am trying to access its versions. Get the versions for the selected file. You can see here the file's version IDs and the download URL for each version. The same can be done when trying to retrieve the metadata fields for a particular file. This time, you need to retrieve an item from the list using the expand equals field search syntax. Let's find out the shared folder where the files resides in the results set from returning the lists. The next call is to retrieve the items or files contained in this list. Our file, tiny.jpg, has an ID of 160. The next two calls retrieves the file using the ID and a list of the metadata fields that contains the custom attribute we were looking for. The code will be written in a similar manner by calling the APIs, getting the IDs, and moving to the next call. As you can see, each file version has a download URL. Using the download URL, you can download the file version. In the last segment for this article, I will show you how the Bicep scripts are used to deploy the Azure resources. The Bicep scripts can be run in VS Code using a PowerShell script and loading the required variables from a file. The Bicep scripts have been written using modules to allow for reusability when creating the resources. I need to clarify a point I was making before when talking about changing a few function properties. Adding the certificate into the key vault gives errors, and after researching online articles on the subject, it seems this particular Bicep functionality of adding a certificate into the key vault is not yet available. As a workaround, I have stored the certificate content and secret into two key vault secrets and modified the Azure function to read them from there. I have created the build pipeline, created a task that uses Bicep CLI to produce a JSON file out of the Bicep script, created another task to build the function app, and published the files to the artifacts directory. The release pipeline contains two tasks, an ARM template deployment task and a function app deployment task that deploys the function app build on top of the created resources. As a second workaround, make note that the deployment parameters are created under the Variables tab and not imported from the configuration file. I have deployed one more time, using a new suffix 08. The Azure resources were created in the resource group. The function configuration is the correct one. I have added the function into the APIM. Let's call the new function in Postman. The function completed successfully. As a final commentary, this article is just a quick glimpse of the whole work done for this proof of concept. If you need to know more in-depth details, please contact me using the information from the channel's introductory page. In part 2 of this article, I will describe how to configure the access restrictions using private endpoints, so the only call you can make is to the APM. I hope you found this video useful. Goodbye for now.